1943, the North African desert burned beneath the relentless sun. German tanks, Tigers and Panthers, once symbols of unstoppable power, now sat crippled and smoking under skies owned by the Americans. The air trembled not from German artillery, but from the thunder of P-38 Lightnings and flying fortresses pounding the sand below. Captain Friedrich Keller, commander of a panzer platoon, stood beside the charred wreck of his vehicle. His men were exhausted, ammunition gone, the smell of fuel and defeat heavy in the air. When the roar of American engines grew louder, he gave the only order left to give: surrender. To the Germans, capture by the enemy had always meant dishonor. Humiliation, perhaps death, but as the Americans approached, rifles steady but not cruel, something unexpected happened. They offered water. Then cigarettes. One even grinned and tossed him a chocolate bar. That night, beneath a desert sky thick with smoke and silence, Keller sat with hundreds of other prisoners. He watched the distant glow of fires where the Afrika Korps had made its last stand and thought of the Rhine Valley, of home. Somewhere, perhaps, his wife had already received a letter marked "Vermisst," missing. Within days, long columns of prisoners were herded toward the ports. There, Keller saw ships unlike anything he'd ever imagined, massive steel giants rising from the harbor. Hastily built but perfect in purpose. The Americans called them Liberty ships. They looked crude, welded together by sheer speed and will, yet somehow invincible. As he climbed the gangway, Keller turned back toward the endless dunes of Africa. He didn't know where they were taking him, only that he was leaving the war behind. The ship's horn bellowed, deep and mechanical. The ocean waited, and for the first time, a German officer looked upon American industry and began to understand what they were truly up against. The Liberty ship creaked as it left the African coast behind, its massive hull cutting through the waves like a floating factory. More than 2,000 German prisoners crowded the lower decks: officers, infantrymen, mechanics, boys barely old enough to shave. The air smelled of diesel and salt, but for the first time in years, there were no bombs, no orders, no war, only the endless rhythm of the ocean. Friedrich Keller stood at the railing under the watchful eyes of armed guards. The Americans treated them not with hatred, but with procedure: meals at the same hour, clean water, even medical checks. Everything ran like a machine. Efficient. Predictable. Industrial. He looked toward the ship's towering cranes and engines, marveling at the scale. Even this transport, built in mere weeks, was a monument to something Germany could no longer match. Each bolt, each plate, spoke of an industrial force so vast that it could replace what war destroyed faster than the enemy could destroy it. At night, when the ship pitched over the dark Atlantic, Keller heard the hum of engines and thought about his homeland. Germany had science, precision, discipline, but America had something else. It had abundance. The prisoners whispered among themselves about rumors: thousands of planes built each month, shipyards launching vessels faster than submarines could sink them. One man joked bitterly, "They build more ships in a week than we can in a year." No one laughed. After nearly 2 weeks at sea, the coastline appeared green, vast, and alive. New York Harbor rose on the horizon like a city from another world. The skyline glittered, ships moved in every direction, and everywhere, smoke rose from factories that never slept. For the men of the defeated Reich, it was the first glimpse of a truth no propaganda could hide. The enemy's real weapon wasn't his rifle or his tank. It was his ability to build. As the Liberty ship slid past the Statue of Liberty, silence fell among the prisoners. June 17, 1943, the gangway clanged beneath their boots as German prisoners stepped onto American soil for the first time. New York Harbor was a living monument to industry, a forest of cranes, steel, and smoke. Cargo ships unloaded mountains of supplies while others waited in line to leave. The war, it seemed, had only made America busier. Captain Friedrich Keller stared in disbelief. In Germany, he'd seen bombed-out factories, starving civilians, and soldiers patching uniforms for the 10th time. Here, dock workers shouted cheerfully, surrounded by trucks filled with fresh food and barrels of oil. To him, this wasn't the world of a nation at war, it was the engine of a civilization that could not be stopped. After processing fingerprints, names, serial numbers, the prisoners were loaded onto trains bound inland, not cattle cars, but silver passenger trains with windows and fans. Even in defeat, they were given comfort unthinkable back home. As the train moved west, Keller pressed his forehead against the glass. Fields of corn and wheat stretched endlessly. New tractors glinted in the sun, driven by women and older men keeping the farms alive. Children waved as the train passed, laughing. The contrast with Europe was painful. There were no ruins, no fear, no shortages, only abundance. That night, as they stopped in Pennsylvania, the prisoners received coffee, white bread, An apple pie, it was more food than most of them had seen in months. One soldier muttered, "They feed us like guests, not prisoners." Keller didn't answer. He watched the faint glow of factories in the distance, chimneys painting the sky with fire. America was fighting a total war and smiling while doing it. As he lay on his bunk that night, the hum of distant locomotives echoed like a lullaby of power. For the first time, he understood. The United States didn't just have weapons, it had momentum, and that was something Germany could never match. July 5, 1943, the train slowed near the small town of Aliceville, Alabama. Beyond the pine trees, rows of wooden barracks stretched out like a military village behind barbed wire. This was Camp Aliceville, one of more than 500 POW camps built across the United States. For Captain Keller and thousands of captured Germans, it would be their new world. The first thing that struck him was the order. Guards stood at precise intervals. The camp streets were clean, every building had a purpose: kitchens, workshops, laundry, a library, even a theater. It was prison, yes, but it felt more like a factory for discipline. Each morning began with roll call, then work assignments. Some prisoners tended gardens. Others built furniture, cooked, or repaired uniforms for the U.S. Army. For every day of labor, they earned small pay in camp currency, enough to buy soap, cigarettes, or even a harmonica from the canteen. Keller soon realized the Americans followed the Geneva Convention strictly: no beatings, no forced labor under guns, no humiliation. It was as if the guards wanted to prove something, that strength didn't require cruelty. At night, men gathered in the barracks to talk, read, or play chess. Some studied English from donated books, others painted or carved wood. One group even started a small orchestra using instruments provided by the Red Cross. When they played, the sound drifted beyond the fences. Soft and human, a reminder that war had not destroyed everything inside them, but the fences still loomed. Every sunset cast long shadows through the barbed wire, glinting like cold silver. Freedom was close enough to see, but forever out of reach. Keller often stood near the edge of the compound, watching trains pass in the distance. He wondered where they were going: to factories, cities, shipyards, places where America built the tools of victory. He couldn't know it yet, but soon, he and his men would see that power up close. October 2, 1943, the mornings in Alabama were cool now, fog clinging to the fences like ghosts. At Camp Aliceville, the guards read out a new list of names, prisoners selected for outside labor. Among them was Captain Friedrich Keller. Destination: local farms. The idea seemed strange, to let enemy soldiers wander beyond the wire, but the Americans weren't afraid. They trusted their system more than their guns. A few hours later, Keller and 24 men rode on an old army truck past miles of golden fields. Farmers greeted them with cautious nods. Some refused eye contact, others offered coffee and water. They were told simply, "Work hard, no trouble, you'll eat well." For men who had lived through starvation, it sounded like mercy. The work was honest: hauling cotton, repairing fences, harvesting corn. For every day, they earned 80 cents in canteen credits. They sang old marching songs under the southern sun, their voices mingling with the hum of tractors and the laughter of children who watched from porches. Keller couldn't believe what he saw. The farms had new machines everywhere: motorized plows, trucks, engines from companies he'd only read about before the war. Even in the middle of global conflict, America was improving its agriculture. Where Germany had turned every factory to weapons, America built both rifles and tractors, bombs and bread. When they returned to camp at dusk, the guards checked them in, counted heads, and smiled. No one had tried to escape. Why would they? There was nowhere to go, and, perhaps, nothing better waiting beyond. In the barracks that night, Keller wrote a letter he'd never sent. "I thought we fought for a superior nation, but I see now, true superiority is not fear or force, it's the ability to work without hate." As autumn deepened, the POWs became part of the American landscape: quiet workers in fields of abundance. January 14, 1944, snow dusted the red clay roads of Alabama as trucks full of German prisoners rolled toward nearby towns. For the first time, many of them would see American life beyond the wire: not the propaganda image of chaos, but the quiet rhythm of ordinary people. Captain Friedrich Keller noticed it immediately. The houses were clean, the streets organized, the stores full, even in wartime. The shop windows glittered with food and tools. He had expected shortages, ration lines, and empty shelves, but instead found abundance. At the edge of a cotton field, an old farmer named Walter greeted the group. His handshake was firm, his eyes steady. "You boys work hard," he said. "War's the same misery for everyone." Keller was stunned. He had never heard an enemy speak without hatred. Day after day, they labored side by side with American civilians. Some guards played harmonicas during breaks, farm women brought sandwiches, coffee, sometimes even pie. What began as suspicion slowly turned into conversation, shy smiles, shared jokes, broken English and German. At night, the POWs returned to camp talking not about war, but about people. One soldier told how a farmer's daughter gave him an apple just because. Another said he'd been thanked for his work by an American. Such gestures, small yet profound, unsettled men raised on a belief that enemies were monsters. Keller started keeping notes in his journal. These people do not hate us. They outwork us, outbuild us, and yet they forgive. Back in Germany, propaganda had painted America as decadent and weak, but here, weakness looked like kindness, and it terrified him more than any bomb. When spring arrived, the fences still stood tall, but something had shifted. The men inside no longer looked at their captors with anger, only with wonder. They had glimpsed a different kind of strength, the strength to treat the defeated with dignity. April 3, 1944. The air smelled of oil and steel as a group of German POWs, including Captain Friedrich Keller, were loaded onto trucks bound for the city of Mobile, Alabama. Rumor said they were to assist in construction work at the docks, but no one was prepared for what they were about to see. As they entered the shipyard, the prisoners froze. Before them stretched a landscape of fire in motion. Cranes lifting massive hulls, sparks raining from welders, steam engines roaring. Everywhere they looked, machines moved in rhythm, thousands of workers, men and women, moving with speed and precision. The Americans called it the arsenal of democracy. Keller had heard the phrase in propaganda broadcasts. But now he saw it with his own eyes. Hundreds of Liberty ships lined the docks, their steel ribs rising like cathedrals. He watched as one was launched, a ship that had been nothing but raw metal 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks, in Germany, that process would take months. The prisoners were silent, awed, no whip cracked, no overseer shouted, workers laughed, music played from radios, and still the output was staggering. It wasn't fear driving these people, it was pride, Keller whispered. To a guard, "How many ships do you build here?" The man smiled. "This yard? 2 a week. And there are 20 more like it." Keller felt his throat tighten. 20 yards, each berthing steel giants at impossible speed. He realized the truth. Germany was fighting not one nation, but an entire continent of factories. At lunch, the POWs sat in silence, watching smoke curl from hundreds of chimneys. The rhythm of machines sounded like a heartbeat, steady, endless, alive. Keller scribbled in his notebook, "Now I understand. Their true weapon isn't courage or tactics, it's production. It's the ability to build faster than war can destroy." That night, back at camp, he couldn't sleep. July 18, 1944, the Alabama heat pressed heavy on the camp, the red clay shimmering beneath the sun. By midsummer, Captain Friedrich Keller and his men had adjusted to captivity. They woke, worked, and slept inside their fences. But something unseen had begun to change the way they looked at their captors. One afternoon, while repairing fences near a small farm, a boy on a bicycle stopped beside the road. He carried a glass bottle of lemonade. Without a word, he offered it through the wire. The guard hesitated, then nodded. The German accepted, drank, and smiled. The boy grinned back. It lasted only seconds, but it broke something far stronger than steel, fear. Small moments followed. Farmers left extra bread by the gates, women sent baskets of fruit, sometimes notes written in broken German, "Peace will come. Stay strong." No speeches, no politics, only humanity. Keller could not understand it. In Germany, compassion was weakness. In America, it seemed to be strength. How could a nation so powerful be so gentle to its enemies? On Sundays, a chaplain held services for any who wished to attend. Some refused, still proud. Others came, sitting under the open sky, singing hymns they had not heard since before the war. For those brief moments, the world felt whole again. One evening, a guard named Miller shared a cigarette with Keller. They spoke in fragments of English and German. Miller pointed at the horizon and said, "War ends someday." Keller nodded slowly. "Maybe it already has." That night, he wrote in his journal, "Our enemy has treated us with more dignity than our own leaders. Perhaps true victory is not to conquer, but to forgive." By late July, the wire still stood tall, but it no longer divided men. They had seen the face of their enemy, and it looked human. October 9, 1944. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine through the fences of Camp Aliceville. Leaves turned gold above the barracks, and with them came something long awaited: permission to write home. For the first time in over a year, Captain Friedrich Keller could send a letter to Germany. He sat at a wooden desk, staring at the thin red cross paper. The words had to be brief, censored, harmless, but between the lines, Truth could still breathe, he wrote carefully. I am alive. I am treated well. America is not what we were told. All around him, prisoners bent over their pages, pens scratching like insects in the quiet. Some asked about families, others described fields of corn and endless trains. A few dared to mention the kindness of farmers, the taste of white bread, the laughter of children beyond the wire. The camp censors allowed it. Perhaps even they understood that honesty was no longer dangerous. When the mailbags were sealed, Keller watched them carried to the trucks with a strange pride. Those letters would cross the ocean, words written by defeated men describing a world their people could barely imagine. A world without rubble or ration cards, a world that built. Instead of burned, weeks later, some received replies, fragile envelopes marked by exhaustion. Mothers and wives wrote of cities in ruins, of hunger and air raids. One note ended simply, "It sounds like you are safer than we are." That night, Keller couldn't sleep. He listened to the distant whistle of a freight train and thought about his letter drifting somewhere over the Atlantic. He had not written about shame, or guilt, or loss. He had written about hope. By late October, new rumors spread through the camp of Allied victories, of Germany collapsing. The men read them silently, each wondering what home would look like when the war was gone. May 8, 1945, the siren at Camp Aliceville wailed once, long and hollow. Guards stopped what they were doing. Prisoners looked up from their work. No one spoke, but everyone knew what the sound meant. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. Captain Friedrich Keller stood beside the barracks, his shovel still in hand. For a moment, he felt nothing, no relief, no triumph, only emptiness. Across the yard, someone whispered the words they had all waited to hear, Der Krieg ist vorbei. It spread like a ripple through the camp. Some men cheered. Others cried quietly, most simply stared at the ground, unable to believe it. The guards did not celebrate, they just removed their helmets, bowed their heads, and let the silence do what words could not. Then the camp loudspeaker crackled. The German government has unconditionally surrendered to the Allied forces. Hostilities in Europe have ceased. Keller sat on the edge of his bunk that night, staring at his hands. He thought of his home in Koblenz, the rivers, the vineyards, the church bells. He wondered if any of it still existed. Was his wife alive? Was there even a Germany left to return to? The Americans allowed the prisoners to gather outside after dark. Someone began singing a hymn, soft and uncertain. Others joined in, their voices trembling through the warm spring air. No guards interrupted. For once, they were all just men and soldiers who had survived the storm. Later, Keller wrote his final entry in his journal. The war that consumed the world has ended. I do not know who has truly won, but I know that here, behind wire, I found something our Reich never taught: mercy. When the lights went out, the camp lay silent under the stars. Freedom was near, but it no longer felt like victory. It felt like awakening. October 4, 1946, the long wait was over. The war had ended more than a year ago, and the ships were finally ready to take the prisoners home. Captain Friedrich Keller stood among thousands of men on the dock at New Orleans, watching the American flag ripple above them. They had arrived here as enemies. They were leaving as something else, witnesses. The voyage across the Atlantic was quiet, no guards with rifles now, only sailors offering cigarettes and coffee. Keller spent hours on deck, staring at the sea. Somewhere ahead lay Germany, but what kind of Germany? After 2 weeks, they reached Bremerhaven. The harbor was a skeleton of steel. Sunken ships poked through the gray water like bones. The air smelled of ash and rust. When the prisoners stepped ashore, the silence was unbearable. There was no cheering, no families waiting, only ruins. Keller walked through streets he no longer recognized. Houses were hollow, their walls scarred by fire. Children played in craters. A woman passed him with a bucket of water, her face pale and tired. No one asked where he had come from. Everyone had their own story of loss. He reached what was left of his home in Koblenz, a cracked foundation, a chimney, and weeds growing where the kitchen once stood. On the nearby wall, someone had painted a word in chalk, Hoffnung, hope. He touched it gently, as if afraid it would vanish. At night, Keller opened his old notebook, its pages worn from years of captivity. He read the lines he'd written in Alabama, about compassion, about forgiveness, about strength without hate. Then he looked out at the moon above the ruins and whispered, "They destroyed our cities, but they did not destroy our chance to begin again." The next morning, he joined a work crew clearing rubble. For the first time since the war began, he wasn't following orders, he was rebuilding, and in every brick he lifted, there was a memory of a place once called the enemy, and a lesson that would never fade. September 2, 1948, the bells of a rebuilt church echoed across the Rhine Valley. Germany was alive again, scarred, divided, but breathing. Captain Friedrich Keller, now just Herr Keller, stood on a hill overlooking Koblenz, where smoke from new factories curled into the gray morning sky. The war felt distant, like a dream too vivid to forget. He still carried the small notebook he had filled behind the wire in Alabama. Its pages, yellowed and creased, told the story of a man who had met his enemy and found his humanity. He opened it often, not to mourn, but to remember. Factories hummed once more, powered by American machines through the Marshall Plan. Children walked to schools rebuilt from rubble. There was hunger, yes, but also purpose. Keller saw farmers using tractors marked "Made in the USA," symbols of the same industrial miracle that had once terrified him. Now, it was helping his country stand again. At night, he sometimes dreamed of the camp, of the guards who shared cigarettes, of the boy with the lemonade, of the distant sound of trains. They were not memories of prison, but of awakening. He realized that captivity had not broken him, it had rebuilt him. In 1948, he began teaching history at a small local school. His students were children born into ruins. When they asked what he had learned from the war, he answered softly, "I learned that power means nothing without mercy. And that even enemies can teach us how to be human." As autumn settled over the valley, Keller closed his notebook for the last time. The ink had faded, but the lesson remained clear: strength without compassion destroys, compassion with strength rebuilds. He looked to the horizon, where the factories glowed in the dusk, and whispered, "We lost the war. But perhaps we found our soul." And with that, the man who once came to conquer the world finally understood the true meaning of victory.